Hello and welcome to episode 71 of the Wisdom from the Akasha podcast. My name is Suzie. I'm your host and I'm an Akashic Records teacher and practitioner. Today I want to get into the topic of diet and the foods and drinks that you consume in respect of your spiritual development journey and the spiritual awakening process. The reason I want to do this is because this is a topic that comes up a lot in my conversations with people. People are confused. They see one person saying one thing online and then another person saying completely the opposite online. And I just want to talk about this, give you some tips as to how to navigate your way through this on your spiritual journey. I'm sharing with you what I've learned from the Akashic Records about this and also, of course, my own spiritual journey. Now, before I get into the specifics of this conversation, this is actually a bigger conversation than food and liquids, okay? It encompasses two bigger conversations that you're going to have with yourself and with your community on your spiritual journey. And these are, first of all, conversations around the absolute necessity of looking after the physical form during the spiritual awakening and during your spiritual development. The human form is divine. It has developed over a very, very, very long time, and it is extremely important on your spiritual journey that you're going to look after that physical form. A lot of the time, the physical form and what it needs is neglected, especially if your spiritual practices are the very up and out, the very spiritualizing, the very masculine energy dominant practices. But actually, we need balance and we need to make sure that we are looking after the physical form. And that's not just the food and drinks that we intake, but that's also how much we're moving our body, how much we're getting fresh air, how much time we're spending in nature. And I'll get into all of that today. The second conversation that this conversation encompasses is we have a need to be mindful in respect of consumption in all forms. Okay, so yes, today we're going to have a conversation around diet and nutrition specifically, but actually we need to pay attention to consumption of all forms and how our consumption of various different forms affects us on a physical level, a mental level, and an emotional level. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to be obsessive or puritanical, dogmatic in this respect, but you do have to pay attention to consumption of literature, consumption of information, consumption of YouTube videos, consumption of podcasts, and start paying attention to how that makes you feel on all of these different levels. Now, before I get into my guidance and my advice on this, I want to say clearly here that if you are connected to and following a specific path or tradition that has a prescribed diet, so a prescribed way of eating, then that is completely okay and that's your path. Okay, so this isn't negating that. I understand why different paths and different traditions have got specific dietary requirements. So if that's you, this probably isn't the episode for you. If, however, you are finding your own way on this spiritual path, you're really trying to embody that spiritual sovereignty and you want to really feel into what's best for you, then keep listening. What I have learned over my time in the Akashic Records and through my own spiritual development and talking to thousands of people on their spiritual journey is there just is no one size fits all for this. There is no, if you follow this specific dietary regime, that you are going to become enlightened. Now, of course, there are lots of people out there on the internet saying that this diet or this way of eating or that way of eating helped them in their spiritual journey. And that's completely fine. Okay, but we have to understand that when someone is saying, this is what helped me, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be right for you. It doesn't mean that there's one size fits all. You are beautifully individual and unique. Your physical form is beautifully individual and unique. By all means, take guidance from people, especially if it's in respect of nutrition and you find their advice helpful. But don't get caught up in that, well, it worked for that person, so it has to work for me. That isn't how spiritual development works. It's a very individual and unique process. Yes, there are spiritual laws, and yes, there are guiding principles, but in respect of consumption, and specifically foods and liquids here, it's very individual and unique. I always remember a few years ago when I was teaching a class of level 1 students, so that's teaching them how to go into their own Akashic Records, access information, and do energetic clearing work. And this one student had gone into their Akashic Records and asked specifically about this. They'd asked, what foods are hindering my spiritual development at this time? And I always remember this because the information that they got was cheese. And this individual was adamant that this was incorrect information because they absolutely loved cheese. Now, anyone who's ever had any intolerancy work done knows that a lot of the time the things that we are most intolerant to is the things that we love. So this didn't come as any surprise to me. But this individual was sharing with the group that they went back into their Akashic Records and they asked the same question again. And they said what they got was this visual of this huge slab of cheese like you would see in a cartoon. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that cheese is bad for spiritual development. It just means that for this individual, time of letting go of cheese was going to be good for them. Okay? So this is very individual and unique. You can, of course, ask in your Akashic Records what foods will help and what foods are kind of causing energetic stagnation or causing problems at the time. One of the best approaches that I see out there is intuitive eating. This has had quite the boom over the past 5 years. There's lots of good podcasts and creators out there talking about intuitive eating. And intuitive eating is essentially just paying attention to what the body wants and going from there. Now, why this is quite difficult for a lot of people is because a lot of people live in their heads. Okay, it's the way our society is designed. It's the way that we function at this time. So as with everything that's worth it, it's going to take you time, it's going to take persistence, it's going to be a little bit of a process to reconnect back to the body and pay attention to what it does need and what it doesn't need. This connection to the body is absolutely essential in your spiritual journey. So I know that today we're talking about food and nutrition and looking after the physical form, but this is part of your spiritual development. Now, it's very normal throughout the spiritual journey and during your spiritual development to have different intake requirements. And this is especially true if you are in a female form because you're on a different cycle to men. And I'll get into the kind of differences in spiritual development for people in female bodies and people in male bodies because there is a difference. But this intake requirement is going to change. And some days you will need to eat more than others. Sometimes your body will require certain foods and other times it will not require certain foods. So I want you all to know that if you're doing this intuitive eating and you find that there's no consistency, there's no, okay, every day I need to eat this and that's it, you know, the old kind of third dimensional diet structures, that's okay. That's completely normal. But something that's very important is that these changes are natural and they happen over time and they happen the more that you're paying attention to this stuff. If you try to force a change, that's not going to help your spiritual development. This is aggression towards the body if you're forcing it into a specific structure. Just because someone on the internet said, I got enlightened because I ate this way, first of all, doesn't mean that's going to work for you. Secondly, it definitely will have not just been the fact that this person had this specific diet in respect of why they became enlightened, if that is even the case. But the third point is that we have to be very loving towards our physical form. Lots of us are not very loving towards our physical form. We override that inner guidance that it has. We override when it tells us to rest. We override when it tells us that we need fresh air and sunlight. So just remember that we want to always be kind to our body and we want to pay attention to it as best as we can to make that reconnection back. So different things are going to work for different people. Yes, take guidance and advice if you are working with a nutritionist, a naturopath, a kinesiologist. That's all great. But ultimately, you want to be listening to your own body and paying attention to how these different aspects of consumption food being one of those, is going to affect you. So now that I've covered kind of an overview of my thoughts on this topic, I want to give you some general tips from someone who's been on the spiritual journey and in the spiritual community for a very long time now that I hope you'll find helpful in your own journey. Tip number one is make some time to move your body. This doesn't have to be hours and hours of exercise, trekking up hills, anything like that, but just make some time to move the body. Okay, we have a very sedentary lifestyle, and we have to remember that our physical form is not that much different to our ancestors. And our ancestors were very mobile. There was lots of walking, there was lots of physical activity, physical labor. And because of our sedentary lifestyles of sitting behind desks, computers, we do have to consciously make an effort to move the body. This helps not only keep the physical form healthy and well, but it also helps to move energetic stagnation that may be sitting connected to the physical form in the other spiritual bodies that you have. So movement is very important. That can be something as simple as dancing in your living room. It can be going for a swim. It can just be going out for a walk. But movement is very, very helpful. Number two is to spend time in nature. I know I sound like a broken record on this one, but the human form is part of Earth. When we look at it from a spiritual development perspective, the human form and the divinity of it is very strongly connected to the earth for a whole host of different reasons. And again, a lot of us live very disconnected to nature. I am very fortunate in that I live very close to nature, but I think most people can agree that by spending time in nature, they feel better, they feel grounded, they feel more connected to earth and to other humans as well. So if you can spend some time in nature, even if that's just going to a local park and sitting for 10-15 minutes, it can be really helpful. If you have no green spaces near you, then definitely, if you can, get yourself some plants. Okay, so just tending to nature, having some nature in your living space will be really helpful. Number three would be to try intuitive eating and understand that it is quite a difficult thing to try. So do go and listen to the different podcasts and things on there. But in respect of, I think, two things that are important that you would hear from people who talk about intuitive eating, it would be number one is to only eat when you're actually hungry. Again, this is not something that we do. We think we're supposed to eat at certain times of the day. It's programmed and conditioned into us. And also where you can, where it's viable for you as an individual, try to get very nutrient-dense food, okay? Whether that is sourcing things from a local farmer's market or just getting food that is less processed where possible, okay? I know that the way that the food system is at this moment in time is that to be able to do that is quite a privilege. So I do want to acknowledge that, but where you can, please do that. Number four goes hand in hand with number three. So what intuitive eating, if you give it a try, is going to show you is that a lot of the time you're eating for reasons other than hunger, reasons other than I feel like I need some nutrition. And if you do find that you are emotionally eating, that you're eating because you're bored or you're eating because you're upset or all of the different reasons, then pay attention to that. This can be a really helpful process into understanding what emotions perhaps we're repressing rather than allowing ourselves to feel, and also things that are going to come up during that. So you may choose to work with someone on this. You may choose to get a mentor or a coach, and that's all completely okay, but use it as an opportunity to assist your spiritual development if you do find that you are someone who is eating for reasons other than hunger. Number five is paying attention to how you feel after consumption, and that can be of consumption of anything. So that can be food, liquids, information, movies, podcasts, whatever. Start to pay attention to how you feel on the different levels. So how you feel physically, how you feel emotionally, how you feel mentally. We are much more than this physical form. And by taking the time to reflect upon how you feel after consumption, on those different levels, what you're doing is you're expanding your awareness to take in those different levels, those different aspects of the self. Number 6 is a little bit of a repetition here, but I'm going to say it because it's important, is don't force any changes. Pay attention to when those changes arise naturally. Okay. Number 7 is have time off consumption. And again, consumption in all forms. Now, of course, when we look at time off consumption with food, we're talking about fasting. And fasting is a huge topic. It's been a practice that's been used throughout spiritual traditions, throughout the ages. And I would definitely, if you want to do some fasting work, don't just dive in at the deep end. You don't know what it is that your body needs. Do work with someone who can help guide you. Do understand the effects it's going to have on you physically, mentally, emotionally. There's lots of things to be taken into consideration when it comes to fasting, hormone levels, nutrition levels, any deficiencies that you might have. So do that guided, but it can be very helpful for people. I'd also recommend fasting from other forms of consumption as well. So maybe having some time off watching Netflix, listening to podcasts, reading books, just giving yourself time off consumption. And that allows your body to recalibrate, and it also allows you to really start connecting back into the body. And my final tip is here, watch out for spiritual ego. Okay, if you don't know what spiritual ego is, I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes, but it's very tempting. And the ego loves this conversation to start to think that you're better than other people because perhaps you're trying intuitive eating, or perhaps you've started a fasting program and you want to judge people and you want to belittle other people. Okay, this is just spiritual ego. This is just ego with a spiritual tint to it, okay? If it happens, if you find yourself judging and you find yourself feeling like you're better than other people, it's completely okay. It's normal to have this happen, spiritual ego to arise, but notice it for what it is. If you notice it for what it is, if you catch yourself and you say, okay, that's okay, spiritual ego is arising, that's where my work is, you're going to develop and progress a lot quicker than if you get sucked into this narrative that the spiritual ego is going to give you about how you're so much better than and so much more spiritual than this person who's eating that or this person who is doing that. So I hope you found this episode helpful. I know it's a big conversation and I know that this is very generalized advice, but of course, as I said at the start, you're all very individual and unique. That's a beautiful thing. Be gentle with yourselves on the spiritual journey. Do take the time to connect to the body and do take the time to receive some guidance from the body, because it is a source of wisdom that we have access to. There's a lot of very good information that our body can provide us with, as long as we learn how to, first of all, connect back to it and then to start listening to it and paying attention to it on the spiritual journey. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week for the next episode.